Well,
Hello.
hello, here, Miss Antonia Hylton.
Hey, thank you for having me. Nice to see you.
Thank, thank you for being here. I love your hair, by the
Thank you. It's
way.
on day 2 or 3, so I'm glad it's still looking okay.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
see, my day 2 or 3 would not have any curls in it. It would be a pretty afro, but it would not be curly like that. Well, welcome to the show. Welcome to Black Authors Matter TV. We're happy to have you.
Thank
And
you. I'm so happy to be here.
well, let's just jump right in there.
Let's do it.
You have an amazing new book, and I heard about your book from a customer of mine, and I have mentioned this particular customer on the show because she's one of our oldest book customers. She's been buying books from us since the year 2000. And we haven't had our bookstore since 2010, but we're still able to order books. And she listens to NPR every day and in interviews with new books that come out. And she told me about your book. And then I looked it up and I said, oh, we need to get her on the show. So, and she's in New York. Her name is Jean Angel Campbell. And I want to give her a shout out, even though she doesn't have internet. She's 80 years old and she doesn't have internet or anything. So, but and she doesn't even have a TV. Miss Campbell says she just listens to the radio. So anyway, I heard about your
Wow.
book through her, and I thought it was a fascinating title and subject. And it's called Madness. Do you have a copy of your book?
Right
Oh,
here.
all right.
Madness.
And it's Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum.
The whole thing is almost unnerving because the word asylum in and of itself, you say the word and these horrible images pop into your mind. And then when you say a segregated asylum, I just start thinking about people who were not treated fairly, whose health was not taken seriously because this was a segregated asylum. So those are the things that pop into my head. And then I don't live that far from Anne Arundel County. So that was unnerving in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book, and are some of those images in my mind, are those kind of what happens in the story?
Well, there are parts of the story that may feel familiar to you. Mental health care for so long has been horrible. I mean, just the reality of what in the early 20th century it looked like for patients of every background could be really, really bleak. And so some of the images people have of asylums and the abuse that went on there, absolutely, that you'll see that in the book. But it's a really complicated and rich story that is actually less about just this one hospital and more, in my view, about actually the soul and the psyche of this country. I really use the hospital, a place called Crownsville Hospital in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, that opened in 1911 and didn't close until 2004, within our lifetimes.
Wow.
And I use that century long history to show how the mental health care system in this hospital became reflective of all of our country's battles over emancipation and freedom, over integration and civil rights for Black Americans, and then even moving into the trend toward mass incarceration and away from mental health care, bringing us all the way up to the present day. And it's a deeply personal book, too. I come from a family with a history of mental trauma and mental suffering. I grew up in the kind of family where people would say, pray about it on Sunday, or we don't talk about that kind of thing, which I think a lot of Black folks can relate to. And, when I was learning about this history, I was really looking for us, because so often the story of medical advancement or medical changes, it's told only from the perspective of white patients and white doctors. And because of my own family's relationship to these systems, because I knew people who had been sent to institutions like Crownsville, my great grandfather was sent to an institution that had segregated wards. I just knew that from a very young age that there was a story here that I think there was a conversation people were starting to be ready to have, and that Black people deserve to really know our history, know our place in this system, especially at a time right now where everyone's talking about therapy more, they're talking about mental health more. You need to know your history to understand your place in the present and your future. And so I really use the story of Crownsville to tell us a bigger American story, a very personal and familial story that you don't takes you into my life and my personal experiences, but also really tells you the story from the eyes and the perspective of the patients and employees who lived through it. And it took me 10 years to get to know these people, to record all these interviews and to gather all these records. But that's the soul of this book.
So you got to interview people who had been there, had stayed there, or
Absolutely.
was
Yeah.
it patients and doctors, or was it just patients?
Patients, staff, doctors, neighbors,
Wow.
siblings, and best friends of patients. You know, I really tried to get to know the whole community because, you know, the Black community in Annapolis, but also Baltimore, really in the DMV area, it has this very rich history there. And in many cases, the Black communities in that part of the country, and many other parts, of course, they feel like their side of the story when it comes to so many important issues, mental health included, just hasn't been told. And so this book is really a reframing, an examination of something that maybe you thought you knew. You thought you understood what these asylums were like. You thought you understood the history here. Well, let me tell you an entirely new perspective. And so this includes dozens of people's testimony, families, records, photographs, transcripts, letters from state officials, patient files, all kinds of stuff that I've uncovered over the last 10 years to really bring it to life.
I was just about to ask you how long it took you to do this research, and you just said it 10 years.
I was actually, if I'm being honest, it's almost 11 years because I was just 19 years old. I got started on this. I'm 30 now, and it came first from a place of passion. I just wanted to study it as a college student. But then I realized as the years went on and my relationships in the community just grew deeper and deeper, that there was a book here, and a story that needed to be told at a national level.
Now, are you from the DMV area?
I am not. I was born in Chicago, actually, but my mom was born in Baltimore, which is something that I write about in one part of the book. My grandmother was an immigrant from Cuba and came to Baltimore as a child, and experienced some of the segregation and racism of the city firsthand in the 40s. And that trauma that she experienced there really shaped my family. And so I have that connection, but I wasn't born there.
Oh. So you have Cuban roots, as well as African American roots.
That's right. So on my dad's side, they don't even we don't even know the full length of the history, although we do know, going back a ways. But my dad's family was enslaved in Virginia and in Georgia.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did this turn in from a passion to a book? How did it go from you being absorbed in it as in college to then being able to get a book, someone interested in publishing a book about it?
At every step of the journey, I'm not even sure that I knew what was going to come next. Certainly at 19, I didn't really have a grand plan. Okay, I'm going to work on this for 10 years and then I'll have a great book. I thought, okay, I'm going to write a 100-page document, basically a senior thesis that I'm going to give to Harvard University, and they will be able to include, the perspective of Black Americans in the curriculum. They'll let them be part of the official story. And so that was the first stage, was just doing the research, getting access from the state of Maryland to get into these records and to understand the history and starting to build some of those relationships. But when I finished, I started to just feel that there was more work to be done. And I was so close to so many people who lived there. There are so many elders in that community who are in their 90s now, and who worked at this hospital for decades. 30, 40 years of their life given to trying to save patient lives there, trying to reform this place that had such a difficult history. And I felt like, they deserve to have their flowers. They should have received more recognition from the government, locally and at the state level. And so I just kept interviewing them and adding more and more interviews to a file that I was building. And it was around 2020, after George Floyd's murder, that I realized a lot of Black Americans were suffering during the pandemic. They didn't feel like they had an outlet, or didn't always know who to lean on to process everything that was happening at that time. And so I started to suspect that, it's not just me who comes from a family with a history of these struggles. There are other Black Americans who are ready to have this conversation now. And there aren't a whole lot of books that when it comes to mental health and self-care and wellness that highlight and elevate us. And so I thought that was the right moment. And so I decided to work with a Black editor at Hachette named Krishan Trotman, because I really wanted this to be a book where, everyone involved at all those editorial levels just understood this history and had that love and extra level of care for the story.
I can see that, and I can see this being a passion story, but what I can also see is it kind of confirming some of the pain that we feel when it comes to the medical community, because I think we're just getting to a point as a community, the African American community, of starting to trust the medical system. And I'm talking not just mental health, but physical health as well. But then we read something like this and then find out that this hospital didn't close, but only a few years ago, basically. And then for some people, it confirms those fears that, see, I told you this is why I don't trust doctors, or this is why I don't trust Western medicine, or this is why I would rather go overseas and and get the spices and medications over there because they don't care.
Well, when people have said that to me, and I have people in my own family who feel that way about the American medical system, I will say, when you see this history, it gave me a lot more empathy and patience and understanding for people who feel that way. Because when you look at the history, the truth is these systems were not built with our humanity in mind. And and I can understand why people would then have the reaction of recoiling from it or retreating from it. I think, though, what I would tell people is that there are, groundbreaking Black researchers, doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, and who are doing all kinds of work, who are doing some of the most amazing research. One woman who comes to mind for me is a Black psychiatrist working in Philly named Dr. Tammy Benton. She is working with Black children in that city and doing unbelievable research and affirming them every single day. And so there are people who do work here and care about us and reflect us. The numbers are very small. And so that's one of the things many experts say we need now is, more support, more encouragement for people of all backgrounds to get through these fields and to get through the difficulties of the schooling so that they can be there to support and really transform the field. But I understand. I mean, let me tell you how this hospital began. In 1911, when officials created Crownsville, they were openly debating their theories about Black people's bodies and minds. And one of the prevailing ideas in the years after emancipation was that emancipation had in some ways been a mistake, and Black people who were struggling or not really getting with the status quo, that it was because they couldn't mentally handle being free. And so they saw Black people's minds and their mental capacities as so different from white people that is why they wanted to build these separate, segregated places. But then on top of that, officials in Maryland decided that while they wanted to build this hospital, they didn't really fully want to pay for it. So they marched initially 12 Black men, 12 Black patients into a forest in 1911 and forced them to build the hospital from the ground up. Yeah. So when they arrived at Crownsville, there was no hospital, there was no ward, there was no room to go relax in. They had to build it, something no other group of patients was ever forced to do. And that's how the hospital begins. And I think that origin story tells you a lot about the lack of trust in the historical way in which these systems have viewed us, right? Because, I mean, the first question it raised for me as a reporter is, how could someone be deemed so sick, so mentally unwell that they need to be sent to an asylum, but also so healthy that they can be forced to build their own asylum all the way from the ground up in the cold weather with their bare hands? And I include some photographs in the book from 1911, from 1912 of the patients who built this place that still stands more than a century later. You drive down Crownsville Road in Anne Arundel, you will see these unbelievable brick structures built with patient labor. And that's really how the story begins. And so it gives me, I have that understanding, this history.
I drive down there.
Yeah.
And I may have seen it and not realized what it was, but now I have a whole different appreciation for this. And it's amazing to me that these people had to build their own asylum, because
Isn't
they
it like a metaphor, right? For so
Yeah.
many of the ways that Black Americans feel about this country, like we had to build it for ourselves and not get the credit, you know?
I was writing some notes because I had a few things I didn't want to forget while you were talking. And one of them is when you said that they thought we were having problems handling freedom, which would be understandable after 250 years of not having it. It would be logical that a person can't just overnight turn on a dime for something they've never experienced. So but the idea that they thought it was some sort of flaw
Yeah.
is ridiculous, but I'm not surprised about it.
Mm.
But there also has been a long held myth, especially then, but still now, that we can tolerate more. We can tolerate more pain. We can tolerate more stuff, discomfort, things that other people wouldn't be expected to tolerate. We're somehow our bodies and spirits are supposed to tolerate. And then that leads to us not getting treatment early for certain things because of that.
That's right. And a lot of doctors believe those things are connected, that the reason why surveys show that medical students to this day will sometimes give Black women less pain medication, less support during a complicated pregnancy is because they believe Black people are so different. And those attitudes, those ideas come from this same period of history where doctors started writing all these theories without even asking and interviewing Black people about what they were going through, what the years after emancipation were like for them. You know, there were a couple doctors who did try to push back on some of those guys and say to them, well, don't you think the experience of having been enslaved might have been traumatic for them? Maybe that's and they were being told, hush, no, we've got it handled here. And so you have to laugh to keep from
right.
from going crazy yourself. And so when you talk to doctors, many of them believe that the reason some of those attitudes linger is because these doctors who I'm writing about, who created places like Crownsville, and Crownsville was not the only segregated asylum in America. There were a bunch of them. Those doctors, they weren't nobodies. They weren't just random guys who got this job and then decided to build this place. Many of them were founding members of organizations. They were leaders in things like the American Psychiatric Association. Their last names are on buildings and roads in Maryland and beyond.
Some names that we'd recognize today if we saw them?
Possibly. I mean, certainly if you're in the Maryland area, people with last names like Marbury, Hugh Young, the son of a Confederate who is one of the buildings at Crownsville is named after him. These are people who were journaling and writing about their beliefs about Black patients, who were very excited about the use of Black patient labor at the hospital. And, there are all kinds of connections. And even the person who drafted the first segregation ordinance in Baltimore, which really set the tone for sort of apartheid-like ordinances that were copycat ordinances all over the US. That person had a tie to Crownsville. So many of these people they were boards of directors, they were leaders, they were going to professional conferences and spreading their ideas around. So they weren't just conspiracy theorists. These were the mainstream people. And that's why some of those attitudes linger, many believe.
Yeah. Something else I wrote down. The characterizations that we've seen in film about segregated asylums, are those accurate? For example, and I expect they are pretty much accurate. I remember, I don't know if you've seen the series Queen. It's the counterpart to Roots, but it's about Alex Haley's mother's side of the family. And she was admitted to an insane asylum. But the one she was in, they had white people in there too. But the conditions were just horrible. I don't know how anybody could get better. It just seems like it was just almost like being caged.
Yeah. Well, that is That is accurate, especially for the first half of the 20th century. They really didn't have much in the way of medication. They tried some different types of, restraints and experimental procedures, and it often didn't work. And mental health care was bleak for everybody of every racial background. But for what I found in the records and in the reporting that I did on Crownsville is that for Black patients, it was another step down. Even worse. And that in addition to going home to these overcrowded, filthy places, that during the day they were forced to do way more work than other patients were forced to do. Working on a massive farm, they would rent Crownsville patients out to private businesses, sort of on a model that looks like what you see prison labor look like today. They would make them serve meals to the staff. So, you might imagine it would be the other way around, but they were kind of acting like the servants to the employees of Crownsville. And so there was kind of this good old days antebellum recreation, going on there in those early decades. And it's not until the 40s and 50s and 60s when Black men and women finally get permission to get jobs at Crownsville. And they finally become doctors and nurses and aides and assistants and researchers, that they start to change the culture. And that is truly my favorite part of the book, when you start to see the heroes arrive and our own community comes into this place and they really start to change it from the ground up. They don't have the top jobs at first. They don't have all the power, but they bring in all these amazing acts of kindness and support to patients. So many of the first Black women to get jobs there, they know the first thing they notice when they get there is that nobody's been properly bathing or washing the hair of all these Black men and women. So they sit them down, they start washing their hair, combing it out, braiding their hair. They notice many of them don't have proper clothes. So they go home and they start sewing and repairing and bringing in clothes to give to their patients. And these are families that didn't have much money themselves. These are their first jobs. So they're taking this off their back and giving it to their own patients. They created innovative recreation programs. I tell the story of a family of a woman named Barbara Arthur and her husband, T. Arthur, whose families built the entire recreation department really at Crownsville, that through this Black family was so successful that other white institutions were coming to visit and write notes and copy what they were doing. And so it's those moments where you see that in spite of all the negativity and the horror and the pain that the community has been put through and the way that the state has treated this institution, there are these heroes who come in and did what they could every single day to save patient lives. And that's the part of the book that brings you back up after you've seen the tough stuff that you're talking about, and
then you start to see the goodness of humanity come.
Exactly.
Well, I applaud you for taking on this project at such a young age and seeing it through. It's 10 years is a long time when you're 19.
It is. I guess if you went back and you told 19-year-old me, oh, you're going to write a book, I would have been so scared. I would have said, no, thank you. But I kind of accidentally, I guess, just kept going and it snowballed from there. But, my family has really been on a journey over the last 10 years. As I mentioned, my family used to be the kind of family that would say, we don't talk about that stuff, go pray about it, or go to your room. My parents had a hard time. My grandparents had a hard time talking about their emotions. But now my family's done a 180. I mean, most of us do therapy. We talk about our feelings during the pandemic. When we were separated, we would get on Zoom and support each other and talk about everything for hours and hours, checking in on each other all the time. And we really have made all these changes because anyone who reads this book will read about a family member of mine who went through a mental health crisis and how that experience really changed my family. And so one of the reasons I think I was able to finish the book, that fire stayed within me, is that it became very personal. The country's mental health care crisis came to my front door, basically. And so, I felt like, okay, for this loved one who's struggling so hard to get care. I mean, they were telling me they were going to these facilities, they were going to emergency rooms and seeing white doctors who just didn't seem to care about them, didn't care about their fears and their concerns. And it was, really angering for me. It was frustrating for me to see how in the present day, there were all these parallels to what I was studying going back to 1911 or 1920 or 30. But it really just put that fire back in me, that feeling like, okay, this is urgent and the story needs to be out there because, you know, we can't imagine a better future. We can't build a better mental health system in this country if we don't first understand why we got here. How did all of this get to this point? And I think the story of Crownsville really tells you, and it shows you that.
Wow. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end. But I do want to know, now that you have achieved this monumental work, because this is wonderful. It's not something that we're seeing every day. Now that you've achieved this, are you doing research for any new books? Or do you want to write about more little known pieces of history?
I absolutely plan to write other books. And I don't know what my next book is going to be, if I'm being honest with you, although I do love that intersection of history and bringing it to the current moment and sort of using my tools as a journalist to help us understand our world and our country. So I know it'll be something about that. But this book was a real labor of love. So I'm going to take a couple months to rest.
Don't just rush into it.
You know, because I want to do it right. I don't want to rush into it. But, you know, this is my baby and it's out in the world now. And I'm so grateful. And, you know, I know I'll do another one someday.
Right, because the book just came out, I think it was 3 weeks ago, roughly.
January 23rd, yes.
So
yeah,
it's new. So
congratulations
on really an amazing project. Also a unique project. We've had over 600 people on this show and we hadn't had that subject broached. Not the way you've done it.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. And it means a lot to me to be able to share this with your community of listeners because, you know, this book is for us. It's our history. So thank you.
Right. We've not talked about mental health many times, but you did the history and you took a specific institution and what happened with it. And
we're able to give so many different layers.
Right.
To address a lot of concerns that are in the African-American community. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for being a guest on the show and continued success with the book.
Thank you very much. I am so grateful to be on here with you, to be able to meet you both. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being here. You have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.